Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Today's episode is a heavily requested episode. We have a deck tech here for the list that I took to the first place of LotusCon. This is the list that I took to the first place of the largest US tournament of all time. So we have my Kinnan list here. And once again, this is the list I won LotusCon with. If you want more videos like this, going through some of my tournament winning decks in more detail, feel free to hit like and subscribe. Let me know you enjoy videos like this down in the comments below. It helps out the channel a ton. And if you're really interested in helping out the channel, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. So once again, LotusCon was an event co-run by Mythic Lotus Gaming and Monarch Media. We had over 200 participants, making it the largest US tournament of all time for cEDH. And yeah, let's break down the deck for today. So I decided to play Kinnan at this tournament, and I feel like this is kind of strange because Kinnan isn't directly associated with my performances in cEDH, but it's actually, I think the list at this point, it's very close to Winota or not tied with Winota for the list I brought to the most tournaments and done well with. It is a very, very consistent list for me. I brought it to, I believe, 3 Mox Masters events, Festival of Nights, and this tournament. So a number of different top 16s, a couple of top 4s, and a win here with this deck. And it's a list I feel very comfortable with. Now, there are a number of different people who play Kinnan. We're gonna start by going over the basics of the deck, and then we'll sort of go out from there. So Kinnan is most known as this creature ramp strategy, right? So the basics are we have a ton of mana producers and mana dorks here. All of our normal 1 mana dorks, we've got Birds of Paradise, we've got Bloom Tenders, all the normal mana dorks that allow you to accelerate a bunch of mana. And with Kinnan on the battlefield, and I guess we should probably read Kinnan, it says whenever you tap a non-land permanent for mana, add 1 mana of any type that permanent produced. So basically what that means is every time you tap a Birds of Paradise, whatever color you made with that mana, you add another one. So for example, Llanowar Elves, you tap, you can add 2 green mana instead of the normal 1 green. With Birds of Paradise, if you add a green, you add 2 green. If you add a blue, you add 2 blue instead. So Kinnan is a mana doubler in the command zone, one of the things that makes it so inherently strong. It also has this activated ability. Look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may put a non-human creature from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library. So Kinnan's ability, despite costing 7, is actually pretty easy to achieve because of its ability to double mana. So now you're able to look at top 5, put creatures in from the top of your library. Now, that's not often the main focus of this game plan, and Kinnan is one of the decks that I'm kind of notorious for saying has such a high ceiling and such a low floor. The opportunities in which Kinnan can be able to flip into big creatures and do that game plan is often balanced by the fact that Kinnan doubles your mana for some of your faster explosive game plans. Whatever game plan is most appropriate at the time is really up to the pilot to judge. So for example, if there's a lot of Rhystic Studies, Mystic Remoras, things like that, I'm going to be much more hesitant about playing things out of my hand or going for win attempts. But if we're in situations in which, you know, there's a lot of variance in what's going on, I know for a fact I have like a Consecrated Sphinx or something in my hand, I'm going to play those cards out of my hand instead of taking a risk of potentially missing in the top 5 cards of my library. So it really does depend on what's happening on the board state at the time. The choice between whether you activate Kinnan, sit back and just activate at instant speed, whether you activate Kinnan at sorcery speed, whether you just go for it during your turn, or whether you use the spells in your hand, a lot of that depends on context, what's happening in the game. And we can cover some of those scenarios as we go on. So we have a lot of mana dorks here for Kinnan's static ability, right? Adding double the mana. That also means we add a lot of artifacts. Now we have things like all of our fast mana here, the classic cEDH staples, but we have even things like signets and stuff like that. And eventually this card that we're going to talk about, Basalt Monolith. Now Basalt Monolith is one of the mainstays of Kinnan because Kinnan actually creates an infinite mana loop with this card. Basalt Monolith says add 3 to your mana and then you can pay 3 to untap it. So normally you can just tap and untap it at any time for the same amount of mana. But as we know, and we just talked about, Kinnan actually adds an additional mana to your mana pool whenever you tap it. So Basalt Monolith will actually be making 4 mana and be able to untap for 3 mana. Therefore, this will create an infinite loop where you generate infinite colorless mana. So Kinnan plus Basalt, infinite colorless mana, which is important for winning our game. The infinite colorless mana we use from Kinnan will most often be filtered into this card here. This is Mirage Mirror. Now the Mirage Mirror loop's a little bit complicated, but to explain it, let's open up our playtest feature here. All right, so let's keep our situation nice and simple. So here's our scenario. We have our Basalt Monolith on the battlefield. we are able to tap it for 4 mana and untap it for 3, generating a loop where we make infinite colorless mana. At this point, we're assuming we have infinite colorless. Great. So now we have our card Mirage Mirror here. And this is where things get interesting. Mirage Mirror has the ability for 2 to activate it, and it becomes a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until the end of turn. This is important for this part. When Mirage Mirror's ability resolves, Mirage Mirror will become a copy of that thing without this ability. So if, for example, I pay 2 and activate Mirage Mirror and have it become a copy of this tropical island here, as soon as that ability resolves, Mirage Mirror no longer has the ability to pay 2 and become a copy of something because it is just a copy of tropical island. So this is why maintaining a certain amount of wording for this loop is really important, right? For this to channel infinite colorless mana into infinite colored mana, you need to be very clear that between activations, you're holding priority, right? So what this does is, say you have infinite colorless mana, I will alternate between putting a trigger of Mirage Mirror on the stack targeting Tropical Island, or any source that makes green and blue. As long as you have sources on the battlefield that can tap for green or blue without dealing you damage, you can make this combo work. So if you have a basic island, if you have a basic forest, if your opponent has a basic island, any sort of combination of lands that tap for green or blue that do not deal you damage, basically. So first copy targets Tropical Island. You still hold priority, and then you target Basalt Monolith. You hold priority again, and you target Tropical Island. You hold priority, you target Basalt Monolith. And you will alternate between those two back and forth over and over again, right? Targeting Basalt, targeting Tropical, targeting Basalt, targeting Tropical. Say you put 40 million copies of this on the stack, right? Here's what's gonna happen. Mirage Mirror will become a copy of Tropical Island. You tap for your green or your blue, doesn't matter which, as long as you alternate between the two. Okay, great. So now that that's resolved, you now allow the trigger next to resolve, which is the copying of Basalt Monolith. So it becomes a copy of Basalt Monolith, and you say, okay, I'm gonna activate the ability to pay 3 and untap Basalt Monolith, which will untap this copy of Basalt Monolith. Then you say, okay, I'm gonna let the next trigger resolve. It then becomes a copy of Tropical Island. So say you floated blue before, now you're gonna tap the Tropical Island, also known as your Mirage Mirror, for a green mana. So now you have green and blue floating. You let the trigger resolve again, and it becomes a copy of Basalt Monolith. Pay 3 to untap it, and repeat this process until you filtered some of your infinite colorless mana into infinite color. Now, if you're in a tournament setting, it is important to note that you cannot use the words infinite colorless, right? Because you have to declare a finite amount. But if you say a large enough number that it's ridiculous for anyone to question you on it, it doesn't really matter. So say like 69 Googleplex, something like that, right? You can name any amount of ridiculous numbers. I go for like 60 trillion of each color, right? It doesn't really matter too much, but there will be certain judges that will ask you to declare a finite number, so don't let that throw you off. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we can filter infinite colorless mana into infinite colored mana. The other way is by using one of our lands, and that land is Treasure Vault. Treasure Vault has an ability to pay XX into it and sacrifice Treasure Vault to create X treasure tokens. Now, Treasure Vault's a very strong card in this deck because the amount of times that you can just make infinite colorless mana, your opponents don't think that they can interact, or maybe they think they can interact with the next spell following up, and you just play Treasure Vault as your land for turn and activate it right away because your opponents won't get priority until the ability's on the stack, and you'll be able to filter all of the infinite colorless mana into infinite treasures. The final outlet of the deck, and an important outlet for the rest of your combos, is Thrasios Triton Hero. So whether you have infinite colored mana and you're activating Kinnan until you hit Thrasios, or if you just have a Thrasios in the battlefield, this is where you pump all of your infinite colorless after a certain period of time. You use Thrasios' ability to scry 1, reveal the top card of your library, and if it's a land, put on the battlefield tapped, otherwise draw a card. Use this ability to be able to draw through the entirety of your deck, basically putting all the creatures in with Kinnan, and usually the cleanest win condition is to use a Finale of Devastation before combat, making your creatures 40 millions, maybe removing your opponent's entire board with Cyclonic Rift and ending them with lethal combat damage. Now, there are other loops that we can go through that we'll talk about later. One of the other main win cons is the use of Tidespout Tyrant and Hullbreaker Horror. Now, these two gigantic creatures allow you to create a loop with Kinnan where you generate infinite mana. So let's create a scenario here. Okay, say this is our board state, right? We have Kinnan, Hullbreaker Horror, these two lands. Let's make them tapped, just for easy's sake, and the ability to cast spells. It's our main phase, right? So what we do in this point is we will tap our Soul Ring and we'll be able to float 3 colorless mana, right? At this point, you can then play our Mox Opal for hand, and this will trigger our Hullbreaker Horror, which is whenever you cast a spell, you can return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. You can also return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, but for this case, we're going to return a non-land permanent. That is going to be our Soul Ring, right? So we've already tapped Soul Ring for 3 mana because it gets an extra mana from Kinnan. Soul Ring will go back into our hand. hand. Now Mox Opal can't tap here because there's no Metalcraft, but that's not really important for this loop, right? We will then be able to pay 1 mana to recast that Soul Ring and bounce the Mox Opal back to our hand. So now, as you can see, we've created a loop. We're able to tap the Soul Ring, float more mana, play the Mox Opal, bounce it back to our hand. And you can do this with any combination of cards that adds more mana than it costs to play them, right? So things like Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, Grim Monolith, Mox Opal, and even some talismans with Kinnan's ability. So Kinnan is actually one of the best Hullbreaker outlets in the entire format, specifically because of the fact that it allows a number of cards that normally don't cost the same with Kinnan. So for example, things like an Arcane Signet normally only makes 1 mana and costs 2. But with Kinnan, it makes 2 and costs 2. So for example, you could go off with Soul Ring and Arcane Signet because of the fact that Arcane Signet is no longer mana negative. And therefore you can create a number of different loops with Hullbreaker and Tidespot Tyrant. Now both of them do the same thing, and it's basically the same thing whether you have each of those pieces. Those are the main infinite mana combos in the deck. It's also worth noting that Nyxbloom Ancient goes infinite with our Basalt Monolith like Kinnan does if we don't have Kinnan on the battlefield, but it also combos infinitely with Grim Monolith because Nyxbloom Ancient triples all of our mana, so it will make Grim Monolith make 9 mana and only untap for 4 mana, because Nyxbloom Ancient says if you tap permanent for mana, it produces 3 times that much mana instead. Now Nyxbloom is also important to note that with Kinnan, it doesn't double everyone's mana again, it basically makes 3 of that mana plus an additional 1 from Kinnan's ability. So for example, if you are tapping something like a Birds of Paradise, normally it would make 1, but with Kinnan and Nyxbloom Ancient, it makes 4 instead. Okay, so those are the main combos in Kinnan. Let's go over the rest of the permanent types and kind of get an idea of what we're trying to do with this deck. A little bit of history behind Kinnan. There's been a lot of conversations about what type of Kinnan to play. When Kinnan first came out, people just stockpiled the deck full of big creatures, so you flipped into them and then just were able to take over the game by mounting hundreds and hundreds of creatures onto the battlefield, swinging out on your opponents. Then there became a part in time in which the Mirage Mirror combo was discovered, and a number of other combos were discovered with it, where people were playing it like basically blue-green Thrasios, where there were almost no giant creatures except for like Consecrated Sphinx and a few other small value creatures. And Kinnan's activated ability was basically useless, and you would sort of just use Kinnan for the double mana value. Nowadays, there's a lot more of this hybrid game plan with Kinnan. You consider it like a mid-range creature combo deck. The idea is that while yes, you do play some of these giant creatures, you also play a lot of interaction, a lot of tutors for your creatures, a lot of interaction for things on the stack or on the board. You also play draw engines like One Ring and Rhystic Study and Mystic Grimoire and Sylvan Library. Sylvan Library is definitely one that I'm on that not a bunch of other people are on, but I still think it's a very solid value engine in this deck. Point is, mid-range / control Kinnan is much more of this hybrid archetype, and Alex Heyer from Playing with Power is the person who really started to push this version of Kinnan into it. Now, he's definitely played some crazier cards like Terastodon and bigger flips like that, but the idea is that there's this sort of midway game plan with Kinnan, which has just been really, really effective. You're not going too heavy into the, well, I'll just dump the board full of giant creatures, but you're also not going so far into that you don't have a bunch of juicy targets with Kinnan. So that's where the list exists sort of nowadays. Let's talk about a bunch of these creatures. So we talked about a bunch of mana dorks here. We have Gilded Drake, one of the best value flips off of Kinnan, even though it is very mana cost effective. A Phantasmal Image is a really good card in here. It may be switched out for a Flesh Duplicate now that that card is legal. That's still one I'm debating. One of the pieces I didn't quite see a lot of in Kinnan until I started working on the archetype was Spellskite. And Spellskite has been huge for protecting my combos in the deck. It is a card I really don't think I'm going to be playing Kinnan without. It's just great at protecting your combos. It protects Kinnan, it protects all of your big value creatures, it protects your Basalt Monolith. All in all, very happy with Spellskite and its place in the deck. Obviously Thrasios, we mentioned how important it is for the combos in the list. It's pretty uncuttable. Endurance is an interesting one because I don't like it in a lot of decks, but in Kinnan it helps. One, when you have infinite mana and you lose Finale of Devastation, you can do a lot of loops with Endurance where you use your Hullbreakers to like bounce Endurance, play mana rocks, generate infinite mana that way, and then also like loop through your deck, cast Swan Songs over and over again, do a bunch of crazy stuff that involves non-Finale of Devastation win cons. It also is really helpful if you're playing in pods that are full of much more aggressive decks. Kinnan doesn't really have a ton of interaction in the early turns. It can have those hands for sure, but you also can, if you're playing in a pod where people are just like trying to jam a win, trying to jam a win, trying to jam a win over and over again, sometimes you need as many free spells as possible, and Endurance does actually fill that that spot. Manglehorn is a new MVP for the deck. Between dockside combos being absolutely crazy and fewer things punishing those sort of aggressive decks in the format, all of your opponent's artifacts coming in tapped while also being able to use it as a tempo piece to maybe blow up a Soul Ring, Mana Crypt from one of your more important opponents. Not only that, but it also hits pieces that stop us, things like Curse Totem and Grafdigger's Cage, which can hurt the deck a pretty decent amount by shutting off Kinnan, do fall for Manglehorn, so Manglehorn's pretty good in that circumstance. Trophy Mage we'll talk about later. There's an interesting combo with that card, which makes it pretty uncuttable for this deck. Lenalendra is one of my newer additions. I wasn't playing it in my early version of Kinnan, but wow, this card is insane. The ability to be an uncounterable counterspell is insanely huge. There are very few people playing things like Stifle, Trickbind, all of that stuff nowadays. So Lenalendra being able to answer those effects is really strong, and definitely a card that puts a lot of advantage on the table. If you can just resolve it early on in the game, the protection for your own wins is really solid, but it's even better at stopping your opponent's wins. You can have scenarios where your opponent has like Ad Nauseam and 3 counter spells, but as long as you have a Lenalendra on the battlefield, it's not really going to be able to stop it. This is perhaps the best Seaborn Muse deck in the format. It used to be Thrasios decks, but now Kinnan is just insane with Seaborn Muse. It's not the deck that you need to jam Seaborn Muse time and time again, but Seaborn Muse is just so good at giving you multiple Kinnan activations, and by the time, if you don't miss on your Kinnan activations with a Seaborn Muse out, you are very likely to be taking over the game by the time it gets back to you. Wandering Archaic, awesome card. Very good in this deck. It's probably the best Wandering Archaic deck in the format. I've done some crazy things like counter an opponent's Cyclonic Rift while getting a copy of their Cyclonic Rift from my Archaic, and then basically completely flipping the scenario into which I had a Cyclonic Rift on the stack and my opponents did not have any. It also allows you to win for counterspell fights and things like that. So Archaic is really solid. One of my arguments for the best payoff in the deck, Consecrated Sphinx, is insane. This card is one of the most stacks resilient pieces in the deck, which makes it pretty huge. The fact that, you know, you can have Kinnan locked out by Curse Totem, or you can be under a Null Rod or anything like that, and then just play a Consecrated Sphinx and just draw your way out of any problem that really faces you is absolutely crazy. Now, one of the pieces that I think is so integral in my version of the deck is Colossal Sky Turtle. I think this card is such a great role player. It's recursion, it allows you to be uncounterable and pull something out of your graveyard. It's a card that I've been pushing more and more people to play, not only in Kinnan, but in the format in general. The fact that this is either an uncounterable bounce spell or an uncounterable regrowth effect is so strong, and all at instant speed with the ability to occasionally just be a big creature if you need one, although that's the last thing I really want to use it for. Tiespell Tyrant and Hullbreaker Horror we talked about earlier, big combo pieces, but not only that, they're combo pieces that allow you to break out of stacks. It makes Kinnan one of the most stacks resilient decks in the format, specifically because if there are pieces holding you out of being able to win, you can just play a spell, bounce the important stacks piece, and you can do that multiple times in a turn and be able to be like, okay, there's 3 things holding me back, play a spell, bounce it, play a spell, bounce it, play a spell, bounce it, and now I'm going to go for my win con. Coma is one of the interesting cards that I'm still on that not many other Kinnan pilots are on. A lot of them move to things like Thorn Mammoth, stuff like that. It just does enough for me all the time where I think it's really solid, but I can easily see it being swapped for something like a Thorn Mammoth. You do need some sort of creature that's big and acts as creature removal, or at least creature tempo pieces, and that's sort of what Coma does for me in this list. Nezahal does a lot of the same stuff that Consecrated Sphinx does. It's a giant 7/7 Mystic Remora. It's pretty good. Now, Nyx Bloom Ancient, as we mentioned earlier, it was actually one of the first cards I cut when I was trying to learn how to play Kinnan. I thought it was just sort of like a win more effect, and I was just so wrong. I was so wrong. It's so powerful, so strong. The ability to immediately turn like 1 Kinnan activation into 3 or 4 Kinnan activations after 1 flip with Kinnan is insane. It adds more combos to the list like we talked about earlier. So powerful. The card's nutty, and like not even to mention what happens when you get a clone effect to come down after you play it. Void Winnower, awesome card. Many scenarios I've not had a thing to channel my infinite colorless mana into infinite colored mana, and I've just been like, well, I have Basalt Monolith, I'll resolve that, play a Void Winnower, and hope it gets back to me. And a lot of the time it does, because shutting off all even spells from your opponents turns out to be really good. This card is just silly. It's just a silly card. So this is one of the first cards that I'm going to talk about that I definitely play a lot of that most other Kinnan pilots don't. This is 10 mana Jin-Gitaxias, Core Augur, and also the other creature you can flip off the top, my cat Miri. Hi, Miri. Jin-Gitaxias is very strong. Now, obviously, as soon as it comes in, it has that ability, end step, you draw 7 cards. So it completely refills your hand. And then each of your opponent's maximum hand size is reduced by 7, making it effectively 0. So as soon as they move to their cleanup steps, boom, all of their hands are gone. Now, a lot of people have a lot of contention with this card because despite it being big, splashy, all of that stuff, they often find that what happens is people will fight over Jin-Gitaxias and then by the time the third player comes around, the person who has yet to discard their hand, it's basically you and that player, and you've already been fighting to protect Jin-Gitaxias, and so that player is often able to present a win con because everyone else doesn't have a hand because of Jin-Gitaxias. One of the things I think is really interesting with this play pattern and that I kind of disagree with, and one of the reasons I like Jin-Gitaxias, is because I will fight to protect a Jin-Gitaxias until my end step. I will fight to keep it so that I can draw those 7 cards, but I'm also not really in the camp of fighting it to discard other people's hands. I will if it's kind of free, right? If they cast a 1-drop spell like a Swords of Plowshares and I have a Mental Misstep, I'm going to cast that misstep very easily because it's basically free, right? But there are other effects that I will not tap out for. I will not overcommit to protecting the Jin-Gitaxias because there's no point in really making that fight happen so that one person can win. I'll choose my battles very efficiently and very specifically so that I don't fall into those patterns. Now, one of the creatures that I do not play in this list is Perplexing Chimera, a very popular option in Kinnan. Sort of originated from Tyler to Play to Win. It's just a piece that I'm not a big fan of. I understand the power of Perplexing Chimera, especially when you combine it with a Homeward Path in your mana base. Now, that's a thing entirely on its own. I don't really like Homeward Path in the mana base because of the curve that we'll talk about later in this breakdown. But a big part of Chimera for me is I find it a little too random. Now, despite it being powerful and you getting to choose what spells you get to take from your opponents, basically there are scenarios that come about where you will have to give up your Chimera to take a spell of your opponent's, and then your opponent has a Chimera, and if you don't have a Homeward Path, there's many scenarios in which I can easily see this coming back to bite you, despite, Kinnan being able to just rely on activations and things like that. So Chimera, strong card. I get why people play it, and with Homeward Path, it tends to lock the game down pretty effectively. I just find that in general, it's not a card I think I want to rely on, and I find it a little too random for me. Into the sorceries, not too many crazy things to talk about. I know Ponder is one of those flex spots that I like in my deck just because we don't have explicit card advantage in the command zone to get cards in hand. One thing to note about Kinnan, and we'll talk about this more as we go on, is that Kinnan's really good at creating a board presence, but it's not really good at controlling and sculpting the cards in your hand unless you have cards like Consecrated Sphinx that you hit off the top, or Nezahal, or stuff like that. So definitely finding ways to be able to fill your hand while also filling your board is some of the craziest things that Kinnan can do. If you have cards in hand with cards like Bristic, Mystic, or One Ring, it really allows you to sort of double up the control you have over the game and allows you to make those pivots that we talked about when we first started talking about the deck a lot stronger. So cards like Ponder for me are really nice to be able to fix the hand so that you can keep advancing your game plan. The rest of these are just big tutors. We also have 2 lands here that are just normal lands in the deck, but with Kinnan's ability to make mana, it's very easy for these to just turn into giant value spells. A lot of standard counter spells here in the deck, nothing really too crazy to talk about except these 2 cards here. Quarter Calling, worth talking about Quarter Calling. It was not in my original version of this deck, and that was such a mistake. It's by far the most powerful tutor in the deck, except for maybe Shared Summons, which we'll talk about in a second. Cord is just the ability to, especially those like 3 and 4 drops that you can flash in, things like Manglehorn and Phyrexian Metamorph or Phantasmal Image, or any of those copy effects. And it's really important to talk about how strong those clones are. Clone effects in this deck are so insane because anytime an opponent plays a Dockside and you can make a copy of it with your Kinnan, you make double the mana that treasures produce, right? So anytime that someone makes a mistake and leaves a Dockside in the battlefield, Kinnan can take advantage of that better than any other deck. But now let's talk about the card I've been hinting at, Shared Summons. So in particular, this is one of those cards that I find that people don't understand the context of in the list, and it adds a lot of context when we talk about the Shared Summons combo. So with Shared Summons, it allows you to look in your library and get 2 creatures. So it's 3 and 2 green, 5 mana for this card, and it's going to be 6 mana to assemble our combo. So it's 11 mana total, but because Shared Summons an instant, you can split this up over 2 turns, which does come to help you a lot. So at instant speed, you say, okay, I'm gonna go grab 2 creatures. The 2 creatures you grab are Trophy Mage and Phyrexian Metamorph. I told you we talk about Trophy Mage a little bit later in the episode. So with those 2 cards, what you do is, these cards are in your hand. With these cards in your hand, you first invest 3 mana into the Trophy Mage. For 2 and a blue, it allows you to go get a Basalt Monolith. As we know, Basalt Monolith with our Kinnan on the battlefield that generates infinite colorless mana, right? So from this point on, we won't have to use any sort of colored mana. So you use 3 and 2 green on the Shared Summons, and then 2 and a blue on Trophy Mage, and 3 colorless on Basalt Monolith. Okay. Now we have infinite colorless mana, as long as we have Kinnan out, which is how we start to produce the rest of this loop. Then, by using the Phyrexian mode on Phyrexian Metamorph, by paying our 2 life, use some of the infinite colorless mana to have Phyrexian Metamorph come in as a copy of Trophy Mage. With that copy, look for a mana value 3 artifact, which will though get you your Mirage Mirror. Now you can execute the combo that we talked about using a card like Command Tower or whatever sort of green-blue land you have, using the Mirage Mirror combo like we talked about, making it a copy of the land, holding priority, making it a copy of Basalt Monolith, channeling all of the infinite colorless mana into infinite colored. So with that 1 card shared summons, we are able to assemble this entire combo for only basically 11 mana in total, 3 and 2 green for the shared summons, and 5 generic, 1 blue for the Trophy Mage Basalt. And boom, that's our combo. Now, I've noticed a lot of players moving away from that line, and to me, that strikes me as a bit odd because that combo has been super helpful for me, and it's very strong. Back over here towards the artifacts, we have a bunch of mana artifacts. Moonsnare Prototype is a really interesting one. It's just increasing that redundancy of early turn 1 plays that we can double with Kinnan. I find that I enjoy it, but I know I'm definitely one of the few still playing this one. Also, it has a channel ability that's just removal spell, so anytime I can turn a mana rock into a removal spell, it gets a little bit of a premium for me. We have Moonsilver Key. Moonsilver Key is really interesting because it allows you to search your library for an artifact card with a mana ability or a basic land card. Basalt Monolith happens to be an artifact card with a mana ability, which is pretty solid. What also happens to be an artifact card with a mana ability is our Treasure Vault, because it's an artifact land. So it has the ability to tap for colorless, making it a mana ability, or to create those treasure tokens. So Moonsilver Key in the 99 allows you to get either Basalt Monolith or Treasure Vault, getting either half of your combo, which is very strong. The other card of note here, and once again we sort of talked about this earlier, is these 4 card advantage engines. We have the One Ring, Bristic Study, Sylvan Library, and Mystic Gamora. Now, once again, card advantage is huge in this deck because Kinnan provides you with a ton of mana advantage, provides you with a ton of board state, but it doesn't provide cards in hand unless you flip over some specific pieces. So these cards are at a huge premium with this deck, but one of the things that Kinnan does better than a lot of other decks is it allows you to play these engines while also holding up mana. The amount of times that you can play like a One Ring as early as turn 2 while also still having a Kinnan out and other engines is very frequently. And Bristic Study plus Interaction or Mystic Gamora that you often will pay for turns on end is one of the biggest benefits of Kinnan, is that mana doubling allows you to play these good engines and also hold up a ton of mana to interact with your opponents as well. Over here towards the land, there's some interesting things of note. One, I'm on 27 lands where I've noticed a lot of Kinnan players are going down to 26 and 25, which I find terrifying. They also are at lower land counts with more colorless lands than me, which is kind of crazy. I think that 27 is probably maybe like 1 more than the lowest I would ever go with this deck. I think 26 would be like the absolute lowest, but for me, hitting those land drops, keeping the consistency with the deck is really important to me, especially when 2 of these lands are channel lands, right? We have Boseiju and Otawara, lands that can be used as spells. So effectively, we have 25 lands as far as those are concerned, and if you consider the fact that 2 of our sorceries here are also counted in our land drop, we only have 23 lands that don't have secondary spell modes. We also have to consider the fact that Gaia's Cradle, despite being an insanely powerful land, can have a downside sometimes. Some other spice I'm playing lately, Cephalid Coliseum. I was playing a few too many fetches in my early versions of the deck, and I find that there were games where I just would fetch and not have any targets remaining in the deck, so add a few more utility lands. Cephalid, really good at being able to occasionally snipe a Thassa's Oracle player. And Minamo, definitely a land that was already doing some crazy stuff, could create synergies where you actually untap Gaia's Cradle with it and do some broken stuff there, but mostly it's in there because we now have that One Ring, and mono blue land doesn't really hurt us a lot in a 2-color deck, and the ability to tap the One Ring and untap it and draw more cards with it is huge. I mean, I've definitely won games by sitting on the back of this land plus this artifact and just drawing, gaining a ton of value for sure. And it's worth talking about Invasion of Ikoria and Tezzeret, just better tutors in the deck. Tezzeret specifically great at grabbing Basalt Monolith, great at grabbing your land, great at grabbing the One Ring, so many important artifacts in this deck, and Tezzeret's really good at getting those. It's also good if you already have the One Ring, like I had in Lotus Con, where I was able to play Tezzeret and start untapping the One Ring multiple times per turn with Minamo and Tezzeret, and definitely won that game pretty handily after that point. So why play Kinnan? In my opinion, this is probably one of the top 3, if not the strongest deck in the format. It definitely has the floor of being able to activate abilities at the wrong time, cast card from your hand the wrong time. There's a lot of like truisms and statements made about the way you're supposed to play Kinnan that can lead you down a bad path. But if you notice, there's a lot of players who have devoted themselves to being Kinnan players on a pretty frequent basis, and those players have been doing well repeatedly in multiple tournaments. We have people like Wounded Satellite, Pingmeister Pong, myself, a number of other consistent pilots with this list. We had even one of the earliest runs by Ego Vinco years ago, just consistently putting up Kinnan results over and over again. So the deck is extremely, extremely strong and very, very consistent for the people who are getting into those play patterns that yield success for them. It doubles your mana, it has card advantage in the command zone, it's able to plant on the battlefield and be recast for only 2 extra mana. So the difference between 2 and 4 and 6 in a deck that's literally stuffed full of mana sources is pretty easy to do. Kinnan is extremely strong, has a ton of payoffs, and allows you to explode out of the gates at a level that just cannot be matched in cEDH by other decks. So let's talk about opening hands a little bit. The kind of opening hands I'm looking for in this deck are ones that allow me to play a bunch of mana sources on turn 1 and follow them up with a Kinnan on turn 2. So for example, a hand like my first example here is pretty solid. We have Cyclone Rift over here, but the ability to turn 1, go play a Mana Vault, filter that into a Talisman of Creativity, and use the 2 colorless floating to be able to play this Spellskite. You could also play the Delighted Halfling as well. A hand like this I would chip away because we don't have that turn 1, turn 2 Kinnan thing going on. This is another hand as well that allows for that early Kinnan curve, right? We can actually get Kinnan out as early as turn 1 here by exiling one of our cards to Chromox and have enough to play Mox Amber and fire off that Ponder. And this is exactly one of those scenarios that I still play Ponder for. Just early scenarios where turn 1, turn 2, you can play your Kinnan and also set up your window for the rest of the game to look for other stuff that you're able to get. A hand like this doesn't do anything on that turn 1, so our turn 2 Kinnan doesn't do anything, so we ship it away. Hand like this one, another nice and simple hand. Turn 1, we can play this Springleaf Drum or the Delighted Halfling. I like the Drum because of our next plays here. Just kidding. I actually like playing the Delighted Halfling because you can then curve it out into the Drum for next turn. So for example, we play our land, we can then play our Kinnan. Delighted Halfling makes 2 colorless mana, use some of that for Springleaf Drum, and we can tap our Kinnan right away to get the Sylvan Library down, still floating a colorless mana. You can do a lot of really cool stuff with this right here. You can also sequence that a little bit differently so that you have an uncounterable Kinnan coming down in that turn and still play the Springleaf Drum. So a lot of cool stuff right like that. You know, next turn I'm untapping with already 6 mana, and then hopefully my Sylvan Library is able to get me another land drop so that I can start activating Kinnan right away. Or maybe I get some more mana and just drop a Void Winnower out of my hand. Here's one of the interesting hands with this deck. We have a turn 1 Dork, turn 2 Kinnan. We're not really doing much with the turn 2 Kinnan, so this one's probably one that we'd want to ship away. And you know, there's something to be said about how strong a card like Manglehorn is, but I still think it doesn't do quite enough. This hand, once again, no turn 1 play, no turn 2 Kinnan. Well, I guess technically turn 2 Kinnan, but garbage. Here's a really interesting one. So we have the ability to, and this is a 6, probably put one of these at the bottom, be able to play a land, play a Mox Diamond, and get our Kinnan out as early as turn 1. Then turn 2, we could obviously go crazy, play Moonservant Key, go crack for a Basalt Monolith, but honestly, in these early game scenarios, I kind of like getting other non-land mana sources instead of Basalt Monolith, because you're not exactly winning with Basalt Monolith anytime soon, but you can get a lot of advantage by getting early artifacts and activating Kinnan. So these are the kind of hands that we are looking to keep in this deck. And I hope that kind of makes sense as far as some of the earlier conversations we had about sequencing and things like that for the curves of this deck. We want to be able to get those early mana sources down, flip into big things like our Glenelendras, Consecrated Sphinx, etc., and be able to press a lot of advantage on the table while also maintaining card advantage in our hand. Kinnan is insanely explosive, insanely consistent, and insanely fast, and definitely the deck I feel most confident bringing into tournaments. It definitely rivals Blue Farm and Najeela and all of the top tier contenders in the format. It's a deck I feel very comfortable with. It's probably my most comfortable tournament deck at the moment, and a deck I truly enjoy playing because it has that sort of explosive, powerful nature, but still gets to be that EDH deck, the thing flipping into giant creatures, doing insane stuff, playing 10 mana spells as if it was nothing. It's an awesome deck, and it definitely changes the way you play cEDH. So I hope you all enjoyed this deck tech. Now, if you're interested in getting coaching from the person who was able to win the largest US tournament to date, or the person who won LotusCon, myself, you can always check me out at comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can find me on Discord and Twitter if you want to learn anything more about that. I do one-on-one sessions where we sit down and have conversations about deck techs, optimizing your list, things like that, or even political discussions during the game. And there's also gameplay coaching sessions where you can sit down with myself and several other players, and we'll play games, have little breaks afterwards to diagnose the games, where important plays happen, stuff like that, and use that as a learning environment as well. If you're interested in any of those, once again, hit me up on on Discord, on Twitter, or find me at comedianmtg@gmail.com. Links will be all down below. Also, reminder here that we are affiliated with Dragonshield. They completely revamped their website recently, and if you use code comedian at checkout, you can get 10% off your order, which is pretty sick to me. Dragonshield products are literally the sleeves I use for all of my Magic stuff, so just jump on in there, use them. It's pretty awesome. All right, everybody. Without any further ado, thank you all for joining me on this deck tech. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you next time. If you want to see more deck techs like this, make sure to leave comments down below. Peace.